Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at Hopkins at Home this evening. We have a wonderful program tonight, and I will introduce our wonderful lecturer this evening, Professor Martha S. Jones.
Thanks very much, Jen, and thanks to everybody at Hop at Home, both in front of the camera and behind the scenes, for bringing me to you all live from Baltimore. It's a pleasure to be here. I was invited this evening to spend some time with you talking about the history of voting rights. My text, if you will, is my most recent book, Vanguard, which is a 200-year-long look at the history of women in voting rights in the United States, with a focus on the distinct history of African-American women in that struggle from the earliest decades of the 19th century until today. There maybe the answer appears oh, well, let me pause and just say, and hope I've got this right. If you have questions, please put them somewhere, wherever you think they might go. I don't really know where that is, but please do put your questions wherever they might go, and I'll be here and very happy to take your questions, hear your comments, and have conversation. Jen Fisher will come back and do that with me in a bit. But let me return to my formal remarks by saying that in many ways, for me, the history and the experience of writing the history of Black women and voting rights was inspired by the 21st century and the ways in which Black American women have become an extraordinary force in American politics. This is a book that ends with the story of leader Stacey Abrams in Georgia, but just as easily could have ended with Vice President Kamala Harris. Stay tuned. The paperback edition will have a chapter on her as part of the book when it is reissued next fall. But for me, the start of the journey really was not in the story of these better known women. It was a more personal one. I began this book in part because I wanted to understand the story of my own grandmother. I wanted to know how she fit into the epic story of American women's quests for political rights in the vote. And that meant coming to North Carolina and spending the day in a reading room among reference books and microfilm reels and acid-free folders. I was on my way to a fall meeting in Charleston in South Carolina, and I stopped over in Raleigh at the North Carolina State Archives. It was a hurried trip. I was anxious. I had a time crunch to deal with, but really I was on edge because I was driven in many ways to find my own grandmother in the records of Guilford County and to discover her story of the 19th Amendment. It wasn't an easy day because halfway through the afternoon, I realized that I had struck out, that I wasn't going to find anything about her there. And though I'm a historian and I like to think I'm a pretty good one, breaking silences is not always as straightforward as we might hope. And here, spending that day in those old records reminded me that I had a great deal of work to do, that it wouldn't be a simple task to recover Black women's words, to recover what they had done, to recover an entire social movement. It is a lonely task, and one that on that day really eluded me. So I was left at the end of that trip to Raleigh with still a burning question. Where had my grandmother been on election day in 1920? When did she finally vote? And these are questions that continued to motivate me in this work. They led to many more hours of research, including along my old family photos, census returns, letters, newspapers, interviews. I knew that I couldn't finish the book without first understanding her and the lessons that her story might teach us about the history of women in voting rights. These are not stories that are in the history books oftentimes, and it was up to me to find them. So let's turn back the clock, if you will, to August of 1920 and just remind ourselves about what happened that summer. The 19th Amendment became part of the US Constitution after a long struggle, the state of Tennessee being the 36th state to ratify the amendment, and it became the law of the land. What did that amendment say? Well, in essence, it was a prohibition on the states. Right? It prohibits states from now using sex as voting criteria, but it doesn't actually promise to any American women the vote. There are two principal myths that I think surround the 19th Amendment. The first is that one that says that the 19th Amendment guaranteed or gave women the right to vote. It did not. But the second myth is one that oftentimes is invoked with respect to African-American women. And that myth tells us that no Black women won the right to vote, that racism kept all Black women from the polls in 1920. Not quite. So what did the 19th Amendment mean for American women? Well, now laws that had reserved the ballot for men in many states still violated the Constitution. Those laws were no longer enforceable. And still, the 19th Amendment, as I said, didn't promise women the vote. State laws still kept women from the polls based on age, citizenship, residency, mental competence, and more. In 1920, it was still true that American women who married non-US citizens lost their citizenship and hence their right to vote. So when women show up to the polls in the fall of 1920, they still face a lot of hurdles, even if sex is no longer one of them. There was one additional barrier, of course, and that was racism. It was true that 50 years before the 19th Amendment, in 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution had forbid states from denying the vote because of race. But by 1920, in many states, particularly in the American South and West, lawmakers had set in place hurdles like poll taxes and literacy tests, grandfather clauses that effectively kept Black men from casting ballots. That had been true since the 1890s, along with unchecked intimidation and violence. The deal was sealed for many Black women as well in 1920. Voting officials had effectively constructed a new color line. So if we ask, did American women win the right to vote in 1920? One of the answers is not all women. African-American women in too many states were merely equal to their fathers and husbands. State laws disenfranchised them in an end run around the spirits of the 15th and 19th Amendments. When we look at the registration numbers, those that we can recover, they reflect those discriminatory laws. Black women had presented themselves to voting officials in 1920, but many of them found that the books were closed. In the fall of 1920, my grandmother, Susie Jones, was 29 years old and living in St. Louis, Missouri, on West Bell Place, just a few short blocks from her parents. I've walked the street, and it is still true that some of those 3-story red brick homes are standing. A century ago, those same houses sat along a battle line that would soon divide Black residents from white in St. Louis. My grandmother was part of what newspapers decried as a Negro invasion that threatened to upend the supremacy of white property owners in St. Louis. Black residents there were being pushed out by segregation ordinances, restrictive covenants, zoning, and redlining later on. When I visited her home on 3973 West Bell Place, I found only a vacant lot. But the empty lot says a lot about why Black women in the city of St. Louis needed the vote. My grandparents' home was a victim of the city's early segregation ordinances, which began at the polls in 1916. That year, voters approved an ordinance that marked parts of the city off limits to Black Americans. The St. Louis Argus that year railed against the results. Prejudice wins elections. St. Louis adopts segregation. Negroes badly disappointed by Republicans. So in the fall of 1916, when Black men showed up at the polls, police arrested them on false charges. 3,000 never got to cast their ballots. Another 900 ballots were never counted. This was the handiwork of the city's Democratic ballot robbers, as the newspaper put it. So there in St. Louis, my grandmother's mother, Fannie Williams, was a teacher turned organizer. And she, along with others, set up a headquarters, a suffrage school at the city's Black YWCA, the Phyllis Wheatley branch, named for the 18th century enslaved poet. And there, Black women ran suffrage schools and prepared for their chance to register. They taught one another how to pay poll taxes, how to pass literacy tests, how to contend with begrudging registration officials. And they turned out. Newspapers reported that nearly every woman in the city of St. Louis that season of 1920 registered, Black and white. The original home of the Phyllis Wheatley branch was torn down a long time ago. Today, all that's left of this time is the nearby Washington Metropolitan AME Zion Church, which still sits at the corner of Garrison and Lucas Streets in St. Louis. Black women had organized there, and they needed it in the fall of 1920. When they turned out to register, newspapers mocked them, painted pictures of Black women jostling with one another too frivolously, attending to their first opportunity to register to vote. They were mocked for their physicalness. They were not mocked for their pretension at wanting to vote. At the same time that Black women in St. Louis are turning out and registering and ultimately casting their ballots, in Daytona, Florida, the educator Mary McLeod Bethune was traveling the state, also trying to encourage and organize Black women to register and vote. Mrs. Bethune met with brutal opposition, organized Ku Klux Klan violence that aimed to keep Black women from the polls. On the eve of Election Day, the Klan assembled in downtown Daytona, full robes, horseback, and they marched out to the grounds of Mrs. Bethune's girls' school, today's Bethune-Cookman University. They were there to intimidate her, to intimidate her faculty, to intimidate the Black women of Daytona. They don't wholly succeed in this year. The next morning, Black women in Daytona get up. They turn out as a group at the polls, hoping that there's safety in numbers. But by 1922, it is true that it is too dangerous for Mrs. Bethune and others like her to continue to openly organize Black voters, openly register, openly turn out on Election Day. Mrs. Bethune will have to regroup and reorganize. One of the places she does that is in Greensboro in North Carolina on the campus of Bennett College, where she visits many times in the 1930s, even receives an honorary Doctor of Humanities degree from there. And when she made those visits to North Carolina, these are the kinds of stories that she told. So in the fall of 1920, Black women look out across the country and they recognize what an uneven landscape it is when it comes to voting rights. Black women in New York, in California, in Illinois, in the city of Chicago, had been voting for years by 1920, and they continue to vote and make important inroads into influencing the outcome on Election Day. But in many other places, Black women, too many of them, are being kept from the polls. The charge for helping Black women to build a new movement for voting rights falls to the shoulders of Hallie Quinn Brown. Hallie Quinn Brown is a native of Ohio, on the faculty there of Wilberforce University, an AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church activist, a suffragist. And in 1920, the president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, the largest Black women's political organization in the country, headed in North Carolina by Charlotte Hawkins Brown from the Palmer Memorial Institute. Mrs. Brown calls together the women of the NACW now to build a new movement for voting rights, one that aims to remedy the deep disappointments of the 19th Amendment. Their objective is now to win federal legislation, right? Laws out of Congress that will give teeth to the 15th and 19th Amendments and permit them to override and set aside the state level laws that are continuing to keep them from the polls. They look to build alliances with the National Women's Party and Alice Paul, one of the most militant suffragists of the early 20th century. They're disappointed. Paul is not amenable to linking arms with African-American women, and she will leave Black women to build a new movement. How do they do that? In part, it is a movement built out of that work in the trenches of voting rights. Election season in and election season out. Black women register when and where they can. They cast ballots when and where they can. They join the Republican Party in important numbers, looking to influence candidates and looking to influence platforms. And in some places like the city of Chicago, they really move the needle. They send the first Black man to Congress since 1901, Oscar DePriest, in 1928. Black women will be part of the NAACP legal team that will use the Constitution to challenge the Jim Crow limits that have been set in place by state laws. They will defeat whites-only primaries. They will defeat grandfather clauses, and they will promote a new constitutional amendment that renders poll taxes unconstitutional, chipping away at the legal edifice of voter suppression across the country, and opening the door a bit wider to the casting of ballots by African-American women. Importantly, of course, is the Civil Rights Revolution. And by the 1940s now, African-American women are going to be the architects, they are going to be the organizers, and they are going to be the foot soldiers, tens of thousands of them, in a mass mobilization of African-Americans across the American South, folks who use nonviolent direct action to hold the feet of Congress, to hold the feet of ultimately President Lyndon Johnson, to hold the feet of the political parties, to the fire of the African-American demand for voting rights. That is a long campaign that takes them 45 years, all the way out to 1965, when indeed Lyndon Johnson will sign into law the Voting Rights Act. But back to my story. After that disappointment in Raleigh, I still was looking for my own grandmother, Susie Jones, and I followed her trail to Greensboro in North Carolina, where she settled in 1926. She had arrived there to begin a new venture. Her husband, David, had been chosen to lead Bennett College, recently reorganized as a college for Black women. Susie was his partner, a president's wife, registrar, and a confidant to the hundreds of young women who came there to study. Now, family lore has it that Susie cried for months after unpacking in Greensboro. It was a small city. At least it was a far cry from the cosmopolitan St. Louis, where she had been raised. That was a city of railroads and rivers that was animated by politics and education, lectures and concerts. But everything about building a Black college for women in the Jim Crow South demanded new kinds of political savvy. Local officials and benefactors, along with Northern trustees and philanthropists, all required tending to. Bennett was premised in a provocative claim that young Black women were destined to be full citizens of the United States, and that among their duties would be the exercise of political rights, including the vote. Early on, Susie met Charlotte Hawkins Brown, founder of the North Carolina Federation of Negro Women's Clubs and director of the nearby Palmer Memorial Institute, a boarding and day school for Black students. Brown shared a harrowing tale. In 1920, Democrats had accused Brown of circulating a letter that advised how the 19th Amendment had given all women the right of the ballot, regardless of color, and then urged all the colored women of North Carolina to register and vote on November 2nd, 1920. The circular was, in essence, a call to action, and it ended with the line, "The time for Negroes has come." White Democrats in Greensboro charged Brown with conspiring to oppose them at the polls. Only her white benefactors who stepped up to defend Brown prevented a full-on witch hunt. Brown eventually deflected in public, in the newspaper. "I do not hold or endorse the views that have been published," she said. As a club leader, of course, she advocated for Black women's votes. But in Greensboro, she disavowed them. There, politics demanded a cruel bargain, the abdication of voting rights in an effort to save a school. I have many times tried to imagine my grandmother there. Perhaps those tears that family lore says she shed that first year in Greensboro were not spilled over missing city life. Perhaps she cried out of frustration. She was building a school committed to make young Black women into full citizens, still in Greensboro, heading to the polls or encouraging others to do so might threaten the future of Bennett College. So what did she do next? Well, in that Raleigh reading room, I had scoured the voting returns starting in 1926, looking for any sign of what happened there on election day. I was hoping to find her, but I found nothing at all, as you know. In North Carolina, no one preserved the details of women's first votes. When the polls opened to them in 1920, little in the surviving document tells us whether Black women managed to cast ballots. Docket books intended for that purpose, docket books that were supposed to be filled out and record who voted, went unused. So I sat that afternoon in state archives under the glare of the fluorescent lights, sort of taking that all in. I'd never know the full story of my grandmother and voting rights. And in my disappointment, the tears that she had shed nearly 100 years ago became my own. And then, browsing through the pages of a 1978 interview that she gave, a half century plus later, an interview she gave with Duke University historian Bill Chafe for his book on the history of civil rights in Greensboro, I finally heard her voice as she reflected on the vexed state of Black women's votes in Greensboro. She explained that in 1951, 25 years after she arrived there was a push for Black voting rights that was waged openly when Bennett students working with the local Black-led Citizens Association registered voters. Then in 1960, Bennett students and faculty organized an Operation Door Knock. Susie described it. Faculty and students went out and knocked on doors and found out whether the people in this area were voting, and followed it up by seeing that they registered and seeing that they voted. It was how she described feeling about those memories that really struck me. They were, as she told Bill Chafe, thrilling experiences. She said this again and again. There at Bennett, Susie Jones linked an early story about women's votes in 1920 to that of the activism of the 1950s and 60s. She explained to Chafe, "I often think about education and whether it's really filling its function as an education for a democracy. Operation Door Knock," she said, "got faculty and students working together and out, so eager," adding that it was just a kind of thrilling thing. So searching for my grandmother's story had certainly required me to confront loss. I don't think I'll ever know in what year she first finally managed to cast a ballot. Was it back there in St. Louis in 1920? Was it in Greensboro in 1926? Or was it in those extraordinary years of the Civil Rights Revolution? And still, I discovered answers to other questions that have been so important to my work. For my grandmother, the 19th Amendment is only a starting place. Her journey to the vote continued by way of a long and troubled road that led to the modern civil rights movement and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Her excitement when Bennett students organized to register voters was fueled by a long history of Black women's activism that had included thousands of other women, including her own mother, Fannie Williams, back there in St. Louis. So as my last bit on that disappointing day, I headed to Greensboro. I inhaled that sweet, familiar scent of the nearby magnolias. I took a seat on her porch on Garl Street. Still there, a white clapboard house where I spent my childhood summers. It's now an alumni center that bears her name and sits just where it did in her lifetime, on the Bennett campus near the main gate. In my search for my grandmother, I had taken a few detours, but I ended up in the place where I had known her best, the place that mattered to her most. For my grandmother, Bennett College had been a suffrage school. And for me, finding her story of voting rights there was, yes, it was thrilling. So with that, I'll say thank you again to everybody out there who's tuned in. Thanks to folks at Hop and Home for having me and including me. And I think I'm going to invite Jen Fisher back. Thanks, Jen. And for conversation, questions, comments. But I thank everybody for coming out this evening.
Thank you so much, Professor Jones. That was so wonderful. It was so nice hearing your grandmother's story. The first question that we have is, what parallels do you see, if any, between those early African-American women voters and the women leaders in Georgia today?
Yeah, thank you very much. For me, the parallels have been striking. We might even say they've been poignant. It is not as far as we might think from the kind of voter suppression tactics that Black women faced in 1920 and those that they and others face in 2020. What do I mean? It was true 100 years ago and it's true today, that these were not laws that on their face said Black Americans or Black women cannot vote. These were laws that were neutral on their face, but were deliberately designed to disproportionately affect Black Americans and to keep them from the polls. And so one of the lessons, I think, out of 1920 for me is reading the new wave of voter suppression efforts in many states, including Georgia, below the surface, to discern the purpose and not simply the design, and to appreciate how close those stories are. The second parallel is that while Black women are very much in the trenches when it comes to voting rights in 1920, they are also nearly singular voices in calling for an ideal American democracy, an American democracy that rejects both racism and sexism in all their forms when it comes to voting rights and participation in the body politic. And so the other thing, I think, when we listen to many of the leaders out of Georgia and elsewhere, including women like leader Stacey Abrams, when we listen to them, what we hear is their message, which is one about the fabric, about the character, about the ideals of American democracy, about the ideal of universal voting rights. And in that sense, I think women like Leader Abrams are very much working in the tradition. And I think she herself has said as much, working in a tradition that is an old one and one that was importantly practiced by Black women activists 100 years ago.
Thank you very much. The next question we have is, what can we do as Black women to keep this movement going forward? Will it take money or a movement on the ground or both?
Well, I think it takes three things, and probably all of them imply the financial support, right, for the work. The first is we have to stay in the ground game, right? We have to turn up every election season, register, vote, make sure those ballots are cast, engage the parties, you know, have a hand in determining candidates and platforms, right? That ground game. There's no substitute for that in this country. You cannot do American politics from your armchair or from your device, right? You just have to be in the trenches, is one of the lessons, I think, out of 1920 and also out of 2020. At the same time, there is the necessity for sort of robust and experienced legal advocacy. And we are watching as organizations like the venerable NAACP Legal Defense Fund that was there 100 years ago and is still present in this story in the 21st century. These organizations need our expertise, need our support in order to do that kind of advocacy that happens in federal courts across the country. And then finally, you know, there is still no substitute, right, for the kind of social movement organizing that I think many commentators would suggest was critical in 2020 as it was 100 years ago. You know, and yet I would say there's one thing that has changed importantly that's worth underscoring. You know, 100 years ago, in 1920, 1921, there were Americans, powerful Americans, who believed that they could craft a political culture going forward that wholly excluded Black women. That was the vision of the 19th Amendment, and that was the vision of Southern lawmakers, Southern mobs, and more, that it was possible to wholesale keep Black women out of politics. Well, the lie of that has been exposed, and Black women are not only here in 21st century politics, Black women have emerged as a force in American politics. And so one question that I think is new for the 21st century is, how will Black women use, yes, the very important influence they have at the polls, and we saw that demonstrated in this past election cycle, but how will they use their power in Congress? How will they use their power in the executive branch? How will they use their leadership in major cities and more? How will Black women use their hard-won political power to continue to be agents of our best democracy? That's a new question in the 21st century, and we are all going to watch as that chapter is written.
Thank you so much. The next question is, and you slightly touched on it a little bit, but I think it's an important one. How do you think your grandmother would feel seeing the integral role that women, especially Black women, played in this recent presidential election?
I think she'd find it thrilling. I'm going to quote her on that, right? Which is to say that, you know, in the critical years of the 40s and 50s and 60s, she's a mature woman, and she's responsible, and not only for raising her own children and grandchildren, but raising up generations of young women who come through Bennett. And I think she'd be thrilled to see this. She is someone who early on works with North Carolina's Pauli Murray, when Murray is sort of really getting her footing as a civil rights activist. Susie Jones, along with a cohort of activist Methodist women in North Carolina, will be responsible for supporting Murray when she publishes her landmark and critical study of Jim Crow laws in the United States, right? Setting the table for civil rights litigators, including herself, in the years to come. So it's to say that my grandmother was someone who was not often at the podium or the microphone, but understood what it took to ensure that other Black women would be there and would get there. And I think she would have found this moment extraordinarily thrilling.
Thank you for sharing. And speaking about Bennett, Bennett has played such an important role in moving voting rights forward. What does history tell us about the role of education institutions in our democracy?
Yeah. Well, you can't tell the long story of Black women in voting rights without appreciating the role that many HBCUs have played in not only educating young women, yes, right, but providing a political education and a political platform. I just mentioned Pauli Murray, so it's worth remembering that Murray attends law school at Howard University, a outlier as a young woman there, but nonetheless someone who not only receives a first-rate legal education in the school that was home to Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall and so many other of the luminaries of the NAACP team. Murray is educated there. She gets a complicated education because Howard Law School is not an easy place for a young woman. But at the same time, you might remember Murray lives in an undergraduate dormitory during her years as a law student and comes to link arms with young women activists at Howard who during the Second World War are sitting in and desegregating public accommodations, especially restaurants in the nation's capital. So Murray at Howard, again, is getting her formal law training, but she is receiving a political education, and she is also at work already on her critically important legal theories, particularly her view of Jane Crow and the 14th Amendment. That's being developed there at Howard. I'll also shout out, if I could, educators like Charlotte Hawkins Brown and the many Black women and men faculty members at a place like Washington's M Street High School, that even those are places of extraordinary political education through these years, and the platform, right, from which many of the activists that we know so well emerge.
Thank you so much. The next question we have is, how do we continue to develop the next generation of activists to engage in the political process and drive a message of equality in voting today?
Right before I came to talk to you all, I was at a high school in the state of Virginia, talking to high schoolers about this. And one of the things I had to confess to them, is that we are going to have to learn as elders how to speak to them about the impact of voter suppression in their own lives. I now have students at Johns Hopkins who come home from election day in their hometowns to tell me that they could not vote because their polling place was moved, because their ID didn't match precisely to the name on their voter registration record. These are 18-year-olds who are showing up to vote for the very first time and are experiencing the real world consequences of voter suppression. So I think we have to, in part, be willing to fully contextualize that, and to provide young people with the history of that struggle, a struggle that persists into their lifetimes, and the examples for how it is that Black Americans, many Americans, have struggled over and for the right to vote. So I'm an educator. It won't surprise you that I think that teaching those history lessons is an important part of the story. And then I'll say, if I could, there are days when we need to get out of the way as elders. And for me, one of the really remarkable moments out of this tumultuous election cycle that we have all lived through in 2020 into 2021 was Inauguration Day in January, when you all might have seen it yourself. A young poet laureate, Amanda Gorman, takes the podium and delivers her remarkable poem. That might have been enough, but I don't know about you. I became a little preoccupied and wanted to know a lot more about Amanda Gorman. I was very moved by her poem, and she's given many, many interviews since then. And one of the things that I learned is that her longer term aspiration is a political one. Amanda Gorman aims to run for, and I'd say, dare say, win. She aims to run for president of the United States. And this is not a fanciful, what do you want to be when you grow up? This is a young woman with a vision and her own sense about how to get there. That includes her career as a poet, a writer, a teacher, mentor, and more. So for me, when I encounter someone like Amanda Gorman, part of what I think is get out of the way and let her show us the way. Now, it'll be quite a while before she's actually eligible to be president of the United States. I think she's 22 years old. So she's got a ways to go. But the question for us might be, in part, how do we allow for, nurture, encourage, and support her sort of vision, like for not only her own personal trajectory, but the role that young Americans will play going forward. I, for one, find her extraordinarily inspiring. And maybe I'll ask my students about that on next Monday, how they see her. But I imagine for them, they see some of themselves in a figure like Amanda Gorman, more so than they might in some of the very venerable elders who are also a part of the political story of 2020-21.
I agree. I thought Amanda was so wonderful, and I hope that I see her as president of the United States one day. Maybe the first female president. Maybe you don't have to wait that long, but she'd be wonderful. To continue on with the election theme, we have, during the recent election cycle, people seem to be surprised by the amount of impact Georgia had on the overall results. Were you surprised, or did you think it was long overdue?
Well, I'm someone who's been a student, a follower of Leader Stacey Abrams in Georgia. And I see Leader Abrams, in fact, I end my book with Leader Abrams because I really think she exemplifies an old and important political tradition among Black women. And it is this: she is nimble, she is versatile. She knows how to switch gears when conditions demand it. And so you all know that Leader Abrams, we might say, had an election stolen from her by way of voter suppression in the state of Georgia not so long ago. She did not sit down. She did not concede. She did not give up. She did not go home. She pivoted. She finds an organization, Fair Fight, and she commits to getting Georgians and all Americans, right, on the rolls to the polls, and to getting those votes counted. So I would say, while I don't think anyone could have quite predicted the outcome in Georgia, I did certainly think that Leader Abrams and the many, many other organizers in the state of Georgia were had learned from previous contests, understood the ground game of 2020 and played it expertly. And so I'm certainly not surprised. I would not have been surprised if they had come very close. And indeed, they did prevail.
Continuing on the election theme again, there are a few questions about the election. And it does say, with the rise of Black women voting, do you foresee a rise in Black women in office where there are so few now? And I know you just kind of touched on that. And I just wanted to see if you wanted to add anything else.
Sure. You know, I think 3 or 4 years ago, the story was about Black women voters. It had really surfaced in 2017, I think it was, when Alabama had its special election. They were replacing their senator who had gone to Washington and to the cabinet. You remember it was a contest where the Democrat was Doug Jones. And we learned that Black women, since 1920 and on through to 2020 and beyond, Black women vote as a bloc in this country. And when they do, they have the capacity to move the needle and to change the outcome, which they did in Alabama just a few years ago. And now we see again, right, how Black women voters are critical in close contests and really can tip the scales in general in the favor of Democrats. But the story is no longer only about Black women voters. And it's not only about Vice President Kamala Harris, though that is a story. Remember that then Senator Harris was one of 6 Black women on Joe Biden's shortlist. And what that should tell you is that Black women had prepared themselves very ably for that moment when the party and the candidate was ready to seriously vet them. And as a consequence, there is not 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, there's 6 Black women, all of whom were formidable, could have made formidable running mates for Joe Biden. And that tells you something about the force that Black women have become in American politics. In 2020, 130 Black women ran for Congress. It was a record-shattering number. I think the record had been set in 2018. I don't want to get it wrong, but I think it was, oh gosh, it was less than half of that. I don't want to say the number and get it wrong, but it was less than half of that 130 number, which tells you something about Black women's political vision, drive, and ambition. They've long been important figures in local legislatures, city councils, in state legislatures. In my home state, the assembly is headed by an African-American woman, Adrienne Jones. So Black women had always had made that record. But now we see Black women aiming for Congress. And again, a story that is still unfolding, but tells us that this is more than about Black women voters, though Black women voters are essential. It is also about Black women office holders.
Thank you so much. The next question we have is, it's about Baltimore. And it says, please comment on your thoughts on the recent unsuccessful congressional race of a Black woman in one of Baltimore, Maryland's congressional districts.
Sure. I'm not a fine-tuned analyst of that contest, or frankly any other. But it's to say that among those 130, only a small number of Black women win. And so the outcome in Baltimore is not distinct or unique. But I do think it is one chapter, right, in a much longer story. And, you know, one of the things that I learned in this study was the ways in which the Black women about whom I write understand that politics is a long game. They never measure success by one election cycle. They are in it for the long game. And that means weathering disappointments. It means losing. It means coming back in the next cycle. So we'll see what Baltimore has in store in the next election cycle. But I do think the lesson out of this book, and for all of us, right, is that if we measure success or the viability of American politics by one election cycle, we will miss the real story. And the real story is in that investment year after year, generation after generation. Most of the women I write about in this book do not live long enough to see the Voting Rights Act become law in 1965. But they invest in the generations. They invest in the women who do, the women who are there, and the women who inherit the Voting Rights Act and continue to change American politics. So, so this for me is a story that continues to unfold, and perhaps we'll see if Baltimore is indeed part of that continued unfolding.
So we have about 5 minutes left. So this will be our last question of the evening. It is based on your research and work on Black women, can you make it some suggestions for how Latinx women build their own political power around the country?
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, I've had the real honor through this last election cycle to learn from people like Maria Teresa Kumar at Voto Latino about what I think she would characterize, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but what I think I learned from her, you know, is the degree to which the Democratic Party still has not fully seen, right, and appreciated the growing Latinx electorate, and especially young Latinx voters who, if I understand the numbers correctly, right, are coming to voting age at the rate of 1 million a year. It is an extraordinary opportunity for American democracy. And yet I think the criticism is that the political parties, it's not unique to the Democrats, that the political parties have not yet resolved themselves, right, to that vision of American democracy such that they would invest. And I think the work of Voto Latino is to bring, you know, new Latino voters, you know, to the registrar's office or wherever they might register, to get them to the polls and get them casting ballots in important numbers. When we speak of the future, therein lies one critical facet of the American future. And yet I think that there is a kind of ambivalence about fully embracing what is an inevitability, I think.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Jones. This has been so wonderful. Thank you for your time and for sharing your story about your grandmother and your family with us, and for the wonderful discussion. It's been really informative and wonderful. And thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a great night.